What I hope to accomplish in this presentation is just to show the members of council and Mr. Mayor what currently is authorized, the current lay of the land, and how that would look in the city of Auburn. I used our building block software to show you graphically where certain things can go, and then provide council with the legal options that might be available to the council should this council wish to make certain authorized changes to where things can go within the city. Okay, so the first piece of the cannabis law is preemption. It is a legal concept that essentially takes away authority from one governmental entity where a larger governmental entity steps in and says, you can't do this, we're going to do this. So the state has stepped in and in part of the cannabis law, the counties, cities, villages, and towns are preempted from adopting any law, rule, ordinance, regulation, or prohibition pertaining to the operation of licensure of registered organizations. You'll see registered organizations a lot in this presentation. That means medical marijuana facilities, adult use cannabis licenses, or cannabinoid hemp licenses. So this is New York State taking away any authority from any municipal home rule law authorized entities, cities, villages, and towns, and counties from regulating marijuana, essentially. Cannabis law breaks down or puts forth several different types of licenses, and with the understanding that, you know, if we are to have a New York-based operation rather than, again, what Chief Slayton described, the products that Chief Slayton described, if we're going to have a New York-centric marijuana universe, then we need to have various types of licenses, and various types of businesses need to be licensed and regulated. So the first, of course, type of business that needs to be licensed if you're talking about an agricultural product is cultivator. Cultivator licenses the acquisition, possession, distribution, cultivation, and sale of cannabis to licensed processors. So people that grow marijuana or entities that grow marijuana. And I guess I should start saying cannabis because I think that is the appropriate term. You can only have one processor's license and one distributor's license along with a cultivator license. So this is the one area where there's some sort of coordination between licensed operations. If you grow it and you get a license to grow it, you can also get a license to process it and to distribute it. So there's this is the sort of combination of licenses that would allow for a ground-up, large-scale operation that some folks envision coming into the city of Auburn, and I think that's a great thing. Nursery licenses are on a slightly different scale, I think. The production, sale, distribution of clones, immature plants, seeds, etc. So they're basically, they will start off the plant's life and then sell it to other licensed entities, so cultivators, cooperatives, micro businesses. Those are all different types of licensed operations, or medical marijuana retail facilities. So this is our the zones in which currently a cultivator and nursery license is allowed. So you have the general commercial, the highway commercial, the central corridor commercial, which runs from essentially the prison to Columbus Street, and the industrial zone. The overlay there that you see is the opportunity zone, where a business may, with large scale plans, may want to come in and get, there's a tax shelter benefit for opening a business in the opportunity zone. I put that up there just for your reference. Processor license, again, I referred to that when discussing the cultivator license. That is the acquisition, possession, and sale from cultivators to processors, to other processors or distributors. So taking the raw product of cannabis and processing it either as flower or turning it into a different product that is consumed differently. And a processor is, if authorized by the Cannabis Board, can operate across the state in as many licensed operations as the Cannabis Board is willing to grant. So you can have a statewide processor license. It's envisioned. So similarly, processing license could be in the essentially the same zones: commercial, highway commercial, central corridor, and industrial. A distributor, that's the acquisition, possession, and distribution and sale from cultivator, processor, cooperative microbusiness, or a medical marijuana facility to retail dispensaries. So you know, a lot of these, the best way to kind of conceptualize them is just to think of alcohol. You know, the beer distributor that we all know of does not plant the barley or the hops, and they don't brew take those products and brew them into beer, and they don't open up a tap and sell you a mug of beer, but they have an economic utility, and so this essentially this distributor's license stands in for the analog of the beer distributor. So that's the best way to think of that, I think. It cannot have a direct or indirect economic interest in microbusiness, retail, on-site consumption, or medical marijuana. So basically, as they take the product that has been processed and sell it to people that are entities that are going to then be the final point of sale. And now you see that, again, the similar zones, commercial, highway commercial, central corridor, industrial zone, and then the I-1 is the new addition, and that I-1 is the industrial park. So that is a use that is authorized currently in the I-1 industrial park area. Delivery license, there hasn't been a lot of guidance from the state as to what that is going to look like, and people, there have been no regulations or guidance that I've been able to find that can be any more clear than what we have here, what came out in the cannabis law itself. So no more than 25 individuals providing full-time paid delivery services to consumers. So that is something that will exist in New York State. Frankly, I don't know how it will shake out within the city of Auburn. Okay, so here's the area I think that most people are most interested in: retail dispensary licenses, acquisition, possession, sale, and delivery license shall authorize the acquisition, possession, sale, and delivery from licensed premises to cannabis consumers. Okay? So it is what you think it is. It's selling to adult people over the age of 21, end product cannabis. No person can have a direct or indirect interest in more than 3 retail dispensaries. The previous versions of the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act under former statewide leadership were very top-down, and this is in my opinion, a direct reaction to that rather than a small number of large corporate entities controlling most of the retail business throughout the state, specifically in the cannabis law, that you are an individual or a corporate entity is limited to 3 dispensary licenses, and that's it. You can't be a cultivator, a processor, a microbusiness, etc. Now, there's this is all brand new, and so there's a lot of unknowns, and this last bullet point, I think, addresses one of these unknowns. How long are these retail entities going to be in business? What is the business going to look like? So the cannabis law requires that a licensed retail dispensary be the owner of real property or essentially have a lease for the time of the length of the license. So there's an attempted at establishing certainty in terms of where these businesses can be and how, I guess, for lack of a better word, trying to combat the potential fly-by-night aspect of a retail dispensary that I think is largely a reaction to how retail marijuana has gone in other states. Unsite consumption, areas licensed solely for the purpose of recreational cannabis use. There's only, again, you can only hold 3 on-site consumption licenses, and again, the same conditions apply to the ownership of the property where on-site consumption would be held. So there is, now we're getting kind of to the zoning portion of this. There is some additional citing restrictions within the cannabis law. That's a retail or on-site consumption establishment cannot be within 500 feet of a school or 200 feet of a church or synagogue or mosque. So what does that look like in the city of Auburn? These are parcels of real property that are within 200 feet of a house of worship. And these are within 500 feet of a school. So that takes out a fair amount of real estate within our city without zoning being applied at all.
Mr. Garland?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Throughout the city, there's many daycare facilities. Is that included in this?
I believe so, Mayor. The cannabis law refers to or defines a school as, and refers back to the particular section of the education law, which it's my strong suspicion, I haven't looked at it in a while, would include registered daycares. You can see here in this map the permissible retail on-site consumption locations in downtown Auburn. You see the bid overlay here. Certain areas are taken out. You'll see the Y is not lit up, it's not yellow. And if it were a permissible location, it would be yellow. The only reason I can think of that the YMCA and areas within 500 feet of the YMCA would not be on this map, frankly, is because of the daycare center that's run at the Y. So that is my strong suspicion as to how daycare centers will be defined. So you can see here, it's looking at this map, there's on Genesee Street, there's a section where the retail would not be permissible, and that's there's because of the church on the north side of Genesee Street there. You'll see in Dill Street and State Street, that area is taken out of consideration because of a church. So this is just to show you that there are limited areas in the city, again, not only limited by zoning. So again, this is permissible in the sense that if we are treating retail marijuana as retail sales, which I think it would be safe to say that's the easiest and most straightforward thing to do, and probably the only permissible way to think of them relative to the cannabis law. So permissible retail locations are, in this particular view, the highway commercial out on Grand Ave. Okay, you can see that the Auburn Junior High School and community college parcels of real property take out some areas on Grant Ave. There is a small bit of highway commercial on the west end where marijuana would be, retail marijuana or cannabis would be applicable. Retail would by right be allowed in the commercial zone. So here are west end locations in the commercial zone. You can see that it looks like St. Francis takes out some potential properties on the west end there. But going up Columbus Street into North Division, there are these are parcels that would be appropriate for retail dispensaries. Now, neighborhood commercial is a little tricky. It's in neighborhoods, thus the name. And there's retail as of right and on-site. Again, the analog for on-site would be a bar or a tavern by special use permit. So here is State Street, where by right, if this council were to treat retail marijuana as simply retail sales, these are places where businesses could open. The 5 Points and Wasco. And on the west end, neighborhood commercial. Central Corridor, there would be, again, retail only. Retail only on the North Street area, York Street. Area that is not lit up there is, of course, zoned industrial. So what can a local government do? Cities, villages, and towns may pass local laws and regulations governing the time, place, and manner and operation of licensed adult use retail dispensaries and on-site consumption. So this is a little odd in that time, place, and manner is a concept that is from First Amendment free speech case law. It is not a concept that is usually applied to land use. So we don't know what that really means. It's all brand new. But I think it's safe to say that that means that the city of Auburn and other municipalities can cut down the number of zones in which retail sales would be permitted. So Steve and I have gotten together and talked about some potential areas or things for this council to think about in terms of restrictions. One would be to add the permitted use of commercial greenhouse to the industrial park, and then clarify the light industry definition of that is within the industrial park's description to include cannabis processor. This would allow a vertically integrated company that grows, processes, and distributes cannabis to locate in largely an appropriate area in terms of neighbors, but also capture some of the tax benefits that go with developing real property or business, starting a business in an opportunity zone. In adding a use of adult use marijuana dispensary, and then regulating that a little bit more, limiting that to downtown general commercial and highway commercial zones, would keep it in areas of the city that are fairly commercial, have good access to parking and good lighting, and are not frankly in neighborhoods. So these are some things that Steve and I have discussed. I want to turn it over to Steve for a second to just kind of talk about the industrial, the I-1, the the concept behind our light industry and how that's defined, because that may better help us come up with some sort of regulation.
Good evening, Council, Mayor. So the interesting thing is we now have a whole bunch of new terms that don't appear anywhere within our zoning code. So now we're taking these terms, processor, cultivator, and trying to figure out where they fit into our zoning code. You take the idea of a cannabis retail shop store. We don't have that, we have retail. So if someone was to come in and say, where can I do this based upon the current code? We'd look in there and say, it's a retail sale. Wherever you can do retail sales, you can sell cannabis. Question really becomes, do we want to do that in the end? Or do we want to go through and apply some reasonable restrictions to time, place, and manner, utilizing the zoning code in order to provide a little bit better control over what's happening? Some of those might ultimately be, one of the concerns is people running in, running out, pulling up on the street. Maybe we require a certain amount of additional parking associated specifically with these type of venues or these type of entities. So what we'll have to do is start looking more deeply into how do each of these currently fit into our zoning code, which was explained tonight, and where do we have to either clarify things within our zoning code. For example, the I-1 industrial district, the industrial park, we allow light industrial uses within there. Generally speaking, processing is a manufacturing, which sounds like a light industrial use, but it's not clarified and pulled out directly within that overall definition. So really what we have to do at this point is say, it's a manufacturer, let's be clear about whether or not that's an appropriate use under that umbrella term, and define that more clearly. If we determine that it's not, then let's be clear about that as well. My instinct tells me that it's a manufacturer, it fits well into that area, but that's where I would like to be able to sit down with council or in this venue, look at those specifics and make sure that we're not missing something, that we're not providing over-regulation, or on the flip side, kind of a free-for-all and having other issues associated with it. So as we move forward, part of it's going to be, do we look at each one of these uses individually, adult use marijuana dispensary, and clearly call that out as to where that is allowed, or do we look at these more categorically? We have both examples within our code right now. We had gone through the process back in 2018 of updating the code and trying to think of every single use that could possibly ever exist and clearly outlining that in the code. In short, not the greatest approach. Previous to that, we utilized a bit more of a categorical approach, and that allowed us to look at the definition and help determine whether or not something fit into there. So I think as we move forward, we want to look more broadly at our code and figure out where each of these uses do fit, but as needed, provide the additional restraint or restrictions and clarifications that help manage these particular uses. And parking was one example that I had. Timing, hours of operation may be another. Lighting might be another consideration. All these type of things we can get a bit more specific about for each one of these uses. So with all that said, what I'm anticipating is within the next couple months coming back to council with some additional information as to how we're recommending to actually proceed forward, how each of these fits better into the zoning, and additionally, there are several other items that have kind of come up and we understand better from a more general zoning standpoint from 2018 that ultimately need to be addressed in that code as well. So looking at not only the cannabis legislation that and the impacts of that, but also any other clarifications, and come back with a comprehensive, I don't want to say comprehensive, but a complete update on all the bits and pieces for council's review and consideration going forward. I anticipate something of that nature starting probably April with the planning board. The way that the process works, if you recall from the adoption of code several years ago, planning board will host a public hearing to solicit public input associated with zoning code changes, but ultimately it rests with council for the determination as to whether or not those get adopted. If there's other questions that you have, myself and Nate are here. We'd be happy to answer them to the best of our ability. Councilor.
It may sound foolish, but could somebody start a business where they order and deliver?
Meaning, where does the delivery, where does the license
Delivered
delivery?
to a resident?
Yes, that will happen. Yes, that is, it's not something that, that's a piece of the law that was preempted by the cannabis law, and that delivery licenses are not something that the city of Auburn can regulate through local law. I can't think of zoning wise how we would address that. It's a little tricky, but yes, that is something that will happen everywhere in New York State. One might, think that probably in New York City there's going to be a bigger market for that than upstate and more rural areas, but who knows?
So along with that, I mean, zoning's great at controlling things that are stationary. As soon as it's on our rights of way and moving around, zoning doesn't work so well anymore. So as I think we understand better the regulations that the state sets forth for what delivery involves, we can better respond to any issues or concerns we have with it within our purview, which is pretty limited, unfortunately.
Anyone else? Counselor, please.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I'll start with the zoning component of it first. You were mentioning requirements that we would put into the zoning code, lighting, things of that nature. Could we also include things, say for instance, for cultivation? As we all know, there's a company interested in coming to Auburn. They presented to Ada. They assured Ada and the public that they install certain mitigation measures so that you will never know what's going on in there. You're not going to smell it. You're not going to know. That's something that they're doing on their own. Would that be something that we should include into the zoning as a requirement? Can we get that specific?
I believe we can get that specific. Ultimately, with our regulations for manufacturing and industrial uses, we actually use a lot of performance metrics, such that smoke and glare of lighting and sound and all those are part of the overall metrics that we apply to zoning for industrial and manufacturing uses. I think it's really going to come down to that idea, and Nate's better at this than I am. How far can you actually go before you're effectively being prohibitive? If you put in a regulation that says you can't do X, Y, Z, and there's no way of manufacturing and not doing that, then I think we're in the wrong. But up to that point of applying industry standards that others would normally apply to ensure that they're applied fairly across the board, I'm fairly confident that we can approach it from that standpoint.
In looking at it that way, I'm wondering if it would be beneficial. So we know that in Onondaga County currently, there is a cultivation facility for medicinal marijuana. Would it be beneficial to look at the code there to see what requirements have been put in place? Because obviously they're not too restrictive because they've been allowed to move forward. I also know from visiting that facility that because this company owns dispensaries throughout the state as well, that there are requirements from New York State for security, lighting, signage. So if we're going to come up with zoning requirements and restrictions in our local code, would it be beneficial to wait and see what the state is going to say the requirements are? Or what they're already saying for dispensaries for medicinal marijuana?
I think it makes a lot of sense within our code to point to compliance with any and all state requirements.
Okay.
And remaining flexible even if we develop something early with an understanding that we just want to get ahead of the curve a little bit, that 6 months down the road, a year down the road, we might be back to you saying, hey, we need to draw a line through several things here because as the state has developed more information and regulations about it, maybe we have something that's conflicting and it's not going to hold up ultimately, or if we have something that's overburdensome, that maybe we realize through discussions with producers that would be helpful early on too, to say, hey, what's reasonable in terms of restrictions and still being able to allow you to do your job without stepping to the nth degree and causing problems and basically a fight between us as a municipality and a producer saying, that's great that you're telling us we can be here, but in fact, your regulations don't allow it to happen in reality.
So on the topic of zoning, if we come up with very specific zoning, we go through this entire process of updating the zoning code, and I'm going to ask a question, and I don't want anybody who serves on the zoning board of appeals to think that I'm criticizing them, but oftentimes the zoning board of appeals does receive petitions from people in the community asking for changes to the zoning code. Will they have a role in this? Would somebody be able to appeal to the zoning board of appeals saying, you know, I want to do something that's not in compliance with the zoning code in relation to marijuana, whether it's cultivation, you know, dispensary, production?
Ultimately, because we have a zoning code, we're required to have a board of appeals, and that board of appeals has the authority to issue any variance within reason set forth by the state in terms of being the minimum variance necessary to any rule or regulations within that zoning code. So they potentially could be approached and say, hey, I want to do it over here, and they look at it and say, okay, it makes sense or whatever. But the hope would be that involving council, looking at other codes, having conversations early on with the zoning board to say, this is why we're putting this together like this, so that it creates a even playing field, that it's fair and equitable across the board, that they might be willing to say at that point, well, if someone approaches me and says, I can't meet a setback, that's okay, but if they're approaching me saying, hey, I'd rather sell over there because I think I can make more money, well, we've looked at that already, and
Sure.
we feel as a community that these are the appropriate locations. So I hate to say, please honor those locations at that point, but that's kind of what it comes down to.
And you have to remember, in terms of retail, that the cannabis board will be meeting out these licenses with great consideration. They will base the number of licenses that will go out to a community on population, on other metrics, but no one has a right to open up a retail marijuana dispensary. It is a particular privilege you must seek from the cannabis board, and that privilege is going to be doled out in a very particular way, as I understand it, that will limit the amount of licenses that any community can have. I think, again, with an eye on how things have gone in other states where there have not been, you know, as significant regulatory effects as the cannabis law is hoping to bring.
So I guess it's based on what you just said there, it's safe to assume that when somebody applies to the cannabis board for a license for a dispensary, they're going to have to disclose to the cannabis board what the location is.
Yes.
Right, so they're not going to be able to open up next door to Herman Ave School because the zoning board of appeals, and this is all hypothetical, says that they can. That the state's going to have a role in that too, through the licensing process.
Yes, entirely so.
Okay. And on the topic of the SLA and the cannabis board, I think under current law in relation to the SLA, State Liquor Authority, local police departments do have some authority to do spot checks on establishments that serve alcohol. Do we know if that's going to be the same with a dispensary that's selling marijuana?
It appears to me that that particular section of the Alcohol and Beverage Control Act was copied, cut, and pasted into the cannabis law.
Okay, good. And do we yet know what the licensing process is going to be? Has that been defined by the state yet?
Well, they're just starting to roll out there was a high-level political thing that happened in Albany when the change of governors happened. The former governor, for whatever reason, did not put forward any potential candidates for to lead the cannabis board, which had the practical effect of slowing down that board's ability to promulgate regulation. So we don't really know what their regulations are going to look like. They're finally staffed up, they're funded, and they're now forward-facing. They're doing virtual town hall meetings across the state. I signed on for one recently. My takeaway from that is that they are firmly committed to the equity piece of this, and I did not discuss that in the presentation, but that's as much of a part of the cannabis law as anything else. Approximately 50% of what the money is that the state takes in through their cut of sales tax and other taxes associated with the production, so the sale from producer to distributor, that is taxed as well. The state's 50% of the state's money is going back into what they call equity programs, and that is startup monies to help affected minority communities, I believe is a term that is used, engage in starting businesses. People that may not have the access or experience in starting businesses, or access to consultants to help start businesses, or access to funds to start businesses. The cannabis law believes that, or allows for rather, 50% of state tax monies to go towards those sorts of programming. And a certain amount of licenses also will be, our priority in licensure is granted to 4 different categories of persons: minorities, women, disabled veterans, and displaced farmers. So there are, there's a lot to be figured out, but however things work out for this in New York State and in our city, equity is going to be a part of it. We just don't know. I have no idea what that's going to look like yet. So that's something you can kind of stay tuned for.
You mentioned funding. I can't remember the exact figure, but in the state budget, the cannabis board is very well funded, at a level that the SLA is not even close to. And I know that's one of the complaints. Anybody that has to deal with the SLA is that they're underfunded, they're understaffed, as many state agencies are. It was reassuring to me that the cannabis board is actually very well funded, and hopefully this process will be done in an orderly and fair fashion.
Yes, Counselor, I would say that part of the reason why the SLA is underfunded is that there has not been a prohibition on the sale of alcohol for close to 100 years, right? And so bootlegging is not a thing in New York, but as Chief Slayton indicated, we have that going on in our city. Sure. And so I think there's going to be a big effort on behalf of the Cannabis Board to engage in programming that discourages the sort of activities that are alleged to happen on Franklin Street.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Mr. Garland, and before you get away, a couple quick questions.
Sure.
I believe council had to enact legislation to allow this to happen in our community. The sale, the growing, the industrial end of it, am I correct, or?
Mayor, I can't recall any. I know that we may have done a presentation to council, but any sort of local law would have been preempted by the passage of the cannabis law. Okay. So that's again the kind of the legal term is bigfooting. That's the state bigfooting all municipalities across New York State. Now there was an opt-in piece of it where a municipality could opt out of allowing sales, and that's, now that I think about it for a second, I'm sure that's what you're referring to. Yes.
So by the same means then, we did opt in.
Yes.
My son always tells me I'm not a lawyer, so I'll try not to be one here. We decided as a council to opt in. Down the road, if it becomes uncomfortable, unwieldy, can we opt out, or are we here forever?
The time in which it works the other way, Mayor, that municipalities that had opted out could theoretically in the future opt back in. But we have allowed for the sale of, by not opting out, the city of Auburn has declared that they're, the sale of retail marijuana will be an allowed business in going forward.
Very good. Anyone? Counselor, please.
So a city can be interested in attracting a certain kind of business to their community because they have water, so recreational industry. I know we're not addressing this specifically tonight, but is there a vision of what would look best for our community in terms of a balance of agriculture, just a balance of how many industries or shops or retail? Do we have any idea what that could look like? And do we have any interest in trying to frame that so that it works best for our size community? I mean, are we being passive about this and waiting for people to come to us from other states that are successful, and they come in and say, we're doing this in 3 states and we know how to do it and we have a great product here? Or are there local people interested? And am I making any sense at all?
You're making complete sense. While you were speaking, Counselor, I was thinking, I'm going to hand this one off to the Deputy Director of Planning. That seems to be something that his department does.
I think at this point, I mean, our actions have been passive, and I think part of that is due to the fact that we don't know exactly where the state is heading with the licensure and how they are going to divvy up that licensure and how many licenses of what types they're going to allow within any particular
that may
community.
be something they want to help us with.
That's something that I think, I mean, it would be great if we had a bit more ability to get out ahead of it and say, hey, it's appropriate to have this many processors in a community of our size, it's appropriate for this. But I think at this point still, it's happening at the state level as they develop their means and methods of regulation. And I unfortunately feel that the state is going to be very clear in telling us this is the number of licenses for these type of uses that we're allowed to provide, or that they will provide within our community. I know that it's unfortunate that's the case, but as we get a better sense of the direction the state's heading from a regulatory standpoint and the rules and regulations that big words that he uses, that they put out for us, we'll better understand how far we're able to frame the overall, as you mentioned, kind of vision around a particular industry.
Thank you.